How's it going? Welcome back to Dylan Pickup's blog. Today we are going to talk about wire, the wire that is in your guitar. What kind is it, and does it make a difference? So stay tuned. Alright, so we get this question a lot. The wire that's in your guitar. The two most common kinds are your normal cloth pushback wire that you see in a lot of old applications, otherwise known as vintage, which means old. So that's the most common thing, and everybody's like, ooh, I want that vintage cloth pushback wire because that's what you have to have. And then this is, well, this is actually a twisted form of what's called PTFE, which is an advanced form of PVC, which I will explain to you. It's actually, this has got Teflon in it too. I will explain to you in a few minutes why we do this. But doesn't matter whether this wire or this wire is in your guitar. Well, what's the nice way to say this? No, it does not matter. So why, and we'll talk about why. Why does everybody think that you have to have this pushback wire in there? Just a little history lesson. PVC was, well, it was discovered in the late 1800s. It was pretty much, they figured out how to make it in like 1938. But they didn't really start using it for anything until World War II, when they started putting it in warships to waterproof wires. It was, this isn't waterproof, and they had to figure out how to make wires waterproof. So they put PVC around it. Extruding it onto the wire wasn't really invented till the late 30s. So what that means is, when the Telecaster came out, and a few years later when the Les Paul came out, this wire, not that it wasn't invented yet, but it was mainly used in military-only applications, and the cost of it, even though it's super cheap now, in fact it's cheaper than this stuff now, it was not then. Availability was way, way lower on PVC wiring, and so of course, if you're trying to start a guitar company and change the world, you're going to use what's most available, and you are going to use what is the cheapest, and this was it. Today, people use it because they think it sounds better, they think it because it gives it some kind of mojo. But we're going to talk about basically why that doesn't matter. So, we're not saying that the wire quality does not matter at all. If the materials that are in the conductor are subpar, then the resistance per foot is going to be higher, and yeah, it's not going to be as good. But why do people think that one is better than the other? You will hear excuse me, about the dielectric. People talk about the dielectric of the insulation of cloth versus PVC, and that PVC is terrible. It is true that PVC wire has the worst, probably one of the worst dielectrics of any insulation. What does dielectric mean? Anytime we put electricity through anything, so we have a conductor, and we've talked about this a little bit, this is really the source of capacitive loss, and in fact the material in a capacitor is called the dielectric. So the bottom line is that anytime there is current flowing, and it flows back and forth like this, because it's AC current in a guitar, and it basically, it doesn't flow like this, but it goes back and forth. Anytime that happens, and it's proportionate to the amount of current and the amount of voltage, electromagnetic waves, eddy currents, leak off of this cable, okay, if this is a bare copper cable. Now, if you put an insulation around this, depending on how much current and how much voltage there is, it will still leak off, but it'll hit this insulation and it'll kind of get lost in it. The effectiveness of, and believe it or not, that loss, those eddy currents, and we didn't talk about this in our eddy current video, but is actually heat. It's basically anything, you know, anytime you convert energy, the byproduct is heat. So what is getting lost off of here is this electromagnetic energy that is leaking off of the wire as electricity is flowing through it in the form of heat, okay? The dielectric rating of an insulator is basically its ability to handle that heat, okay? And its ability to like soak it up and not let it to the outside, okay? So back in the day, all wire, and this stuff's rated for like 300 volts, right? We only use like 300 millivolts. So, but all wire in your house and everything was this cloth. And the reason for it is they did not have anything that could stand up to any kind of heat with any kind of current on it. They just couldn't. Cloth was the way to do it. In fact, in really, really high voltage applications sometimes, especially a little bit older ones, you'll see cloth wire still because it handles heat. So that is the thing. And the way they test, now there's many, many different tests, and you can do lots of research about all the math, about how they figure all this. But the bottom line is a lot of times what they'll do is they'll take a wire and they'll hook it up to a film of material that is this stuff, and they'll run current through it, because current can actually run through, in the form of this loss of energy, through a non-conductive material, and as it heats up it will melt it. And so they test that, and that's one of the ways. There's many, many ways, and it's all super sciencey and a lot of math, but that's one of the ways they do it, is test how much signal you will lose by heating this stuff up and pretty much trying to melt it. So what does that mean for us in a guitar? Well, obviously we don't want signal loss. We talked about that in our cable length video, that we don't want signal leaking off of our cables, okay? But you have to remember something. This is compounded by two things: current and voltage, neither of which are present to any almost measurable degree in a guitar at all. Almost certainly current is almost not even measurable. It is, but not to the point that it would be leaking off to any measurable degree here. In comparison, now it does, but in comparison to one wire or the other. And also, there is the voltage, we're talking millivolts, okay? So we're talking millivolts. Now you're gonna say, well, since we're talking millivolts, then proportionately, you would wanna lose less. That is true. Again, though, we're talking about a comparison between two products that people think are bad versus good. It's almost gonna be immeasurable. And you can say, well, if I go to this website and it says this is the dielectric efficiency of PVC versus this is the dielectric efficiency of cloth, and cloth is way better. Yeah, at 300 volts with 20 amps going through it. Yes, but not at 300 millivolts with hardly measurable amps going through it. So it's all proportionate. And in a guitar wire especially, and then the next question is, well, why does it matter with guitar cables? Or why does, so I'm kind of an audiophile guy too, so I have a kind of a gnarly home theater, and I pay a lot of attention to cables in my home theater, and that's a big thing with like hi-fi stuff. So why is that? Obviously, again, we're going back to long cable runs. You know, if my theater room is like 22 feet long, then I'm gonna have huge long cable runs, and now we're talking about enough of a distance for all this stuff to make a difference. When we build a guitar and we go from 2 pots to a switch to a capacitor, what are we talking? 8 inches? 8-9 inches of wire in one guitar. So, you know, it's just kind of, yes, it exists. The factors between wires exist. but are they measurable enough to where you're going to be able to hear it in your tone? People are going to tell you all day long, yeah, I can hear a difference. But there's something else you got to remember. All this is only as strong as its weakest link. So if we have 4 pots and we have an output jack and we have a switch over here, you know, one of those 3-way things with a wire going off and a wire going off and a wire going off, and we have our ground ring on our Les Paul wiring, and we have our output, this is going to ground, and we have our output jack going over here. What do we have more than wire in this guitar? Solder joints. Solder joints are probably, unless they are good, a weaker link than any wire that you could put in a guitar. Because all your grounds, if this is a cold solder, it's pretty much as good as not being soldered at all. The resistance in that spot will rise, and let me tell you what, it will very quickly have a way bigger difference in your tone than any PVC coated wire. Now, do I think that PVC coated wire is bad? I don't think it's bad, but I do think there is better and worse. And so what we do is we use something called PTFE, which has got some Teflon in it. So it's a little different. It's actually, honestly, it's easier to work with is the reason I use it. But the other thing they do with new wire now instead of old cheap PVC is here's the center conductor. Here's the insulation around the outside. It's not that big to scale, but and what they do, for lack of a better word, they blow bubbles in it, and it makes the wire around the insulation around the outside kind of like foamy, and then it gets more solid as it gets towards the outside. They basically, like I said, they basically blow bubbles in it. They inject it so that it's got foam. It's kind of like, it's PVC Teflon stuff still, but right at the wire, it's got foam in it. And what that does is that minimizes this also. It also makes it easier to work with, and the material doesn't melt when you solder it. That's probably one of the big reasons why we use them. So is there a difference? Yeah. I mean, if you get a really cheap guitar, I don't like using the word cheap, a really super inexpensive guitar from somewhere that ends in, you know, NA or IA, then you know, you get that real stretchy insulation on there, and it's real loose on the wire, and it's and the wire's really brittle when you bend it. Yeah, you're probably going to hear some difference in that stuff, because and it's actually more the material in the conductor than it is actually the insulation. It's also the quality of the solder joints and the quality of the pots in the guitar, as well as the caps. So when somebody calls me up and says, what wire are you going to use on my pickups, or what wire are you going to use when you put your pickups in my guitar, I'm going to tell them I'm going to use this stuff right here. We use some pushback cloth on some stuff, but I'm going to use this stuff right here. And then the next question is, why do you twist it together? Well, that goes back to our whole shielding thing. When you twist two conductors together, Alexander Graham Bell actually invented this. When you twist two conductors together, it cuts down on EMI, electromagnetic interference. And as we know, electromagnetic interference is probably more of a factor than anything in a guitar. You know, the off-gassing on a wire is way less of a factor than EMI. So fixing that by doing this, that does help, along with all the other shielding stuff we talked about the other day. And having good solders. And the other thing too, there's another kind of wire, and I don't have any here, but I'm going to just show you that I do have some. I don't know where it is, because I don't use it. This is, I got to wire these humbuckers up today, but this is the wire that we use for our humbuckers. It's a 5-conductor stranded wire. Oh, I'll get to that in a minute too. It's a 5-conductor wire. Why don't we use the traditional braided stuff on the outside with the single conductor in the middle? I don't use it because we want you to have as many connectivity possibilities possible. You can't coil split with that wire. You certainly can't phase shift with it, because then your live wire ends up being on the outside, it grounds against your chassis. You can't do that. So 5 conductor wire is the way to go. There is good and bad 5 conductor wire. I mean, if you pull on this and the wire comes out, that's not good. We have our stuff made in the United States. This is actually made in the United States, and it's super tight. Works really good. The shielding is really good. And that's what we use on our hookup wire on our pickups. I mean, stuff's really good. So, but that's why we don't use the braided thing. One last thing, stranded versus solid. Because people say, which one should I use? Stranded versus solid. Truth is, it really doesn't matter. The truth is, it really doesn't matter with what we're using. Again, because that goes back to cable length issues. We're only going like 8 inches. But something interesting, the biggest thing is the flexibility. So if you have a wire that is capable of carrying a certain amount of energy and it is stranded, it looks like this. I mean, that's my loosely drawn stranded wire with the insulation around the outside. If you have a solid wire of the same exact capabilities, it looks like this. It's by a large percentage very small, because there's no air in it, basically, because you have a bunch of strands and it ends up being bigger to do the same thing. The thing is that this stuff is more brittle, you can't bend it, and getting it through channels in your guitar, it's just harder. I mean, you could do it if you wanted to, and I know some guys that do because they like it to keep a shape and stuff, you know. But this is just a lot easier to work with. And that's really that. I mean, you could get into some super technical science as to why skin effect and all this stuff with stranded wire versus solid and the surface area and all that stuff, and solid's better. But again, we're talking about 8 inches, we're talking about millivolts, and we're talking about barely measurable current. It's just not that big a deal. It isn't. So that is wire. If you have any questions or you want to add anything to it, anything to our blog, have any additional questions you want to raise or you want me to do a blog about, please let me know. This has been a lot of fun. Thanks for stopping by, and we'll see you tomorrow.